Good afternoon. My name is Cleve Corner. I'm the manager of author and speaker engagement at the Pratt Library. We are here at the Light Street branch. I appreciate everybody coming out this afternoon. Kay and Susan are going to speak for about 45 minutes. And if there are any questions here or from our online audience, we're happy to take them right after. This afternoon, I'm happy to welcome Kay White-Drew to the Pratt Library to discuss her memoir, Stress Test. Kay's story takes the reader through a 5-year crucible from the first day of medical school through the last day of an internship year in pediatrics, and from the gross anatomy lab to the neonatal intensive care unit. Unveiling the cadaver in the first days of medical school, while her mother lay dying in an oncology ward, the excitement of making difficult diagnoses, and the terror and tragedy of disastrous mistakes. The joy connecting with patients, and the heartbreak of losing them, it's all here. Women comprise less than a fifth of the author's medical school class, so the scourge of sexism riddles the narrative. And as a white woman in the largely black urban environment of West Baltimore, barely a decade after the civil rights movement and long before Black Lives Matter, she bore witness throughout her training to the human cost of racism. This memoir joins a growing body of work by women physicians in recent years, including several memoirs. What makes it unique is the era when it was written, a time when women were still years from comprising half or more of medical school students, and when the second wave of feminism was surging. Many of the fears, griefs, and struggles that women in medicine face today are the same ones the author grappled with decades earlier. This afternoon, Kay will be joined in conversation by writer Susan Keatley. Kay White-Drew is a retired neonatal, I can do this, I practice this. Kay White-Drew is a retired neonatologist. Yes, I got that. Her work has appeared in New Verse News, Gargoyle, and Loch Raven Review, where her essay was nominated for a Pushcart Prize. Susan Keatley has a PhD in chemistry and has written about scientists, computational biology, cancer, and science education, among other topics, for the New York Times, the Simons Foundation, and the Princeton Alumni Weekly. Formerly a high school science teacher, she created and hosts the Science Fair podcast, which connects specific classroom concepts to what real scientists do. She has been a moderator at the Newburyport Literary Festival and created the Manor Mill Prose Night, author reading and open mic series in Moncton, Maryland. It's my great pleasure to welcome Kay White-Drew and Susan Keatley to the Pratt Library.
Hello? Is this on? Okay. I'm going to start by reading a couple of sections from my book. I'm going to start with when I first arrived in Baltimore to start medical school in the fall of 73, actually the late summer of 73. And the name of the chapter is Incipit Vita Nova, which means Here Beginneth a New Life. The place didn't look like much from the street. A 3-story row house of red-painted brick in need of repair, its marble front stoop, an iconic piece of Baltimore architecture, was its sole redeeming feature. My father and I gazed up at it with trepidation. Having grown up in suburban and rural areas, followed by 4 years of Wellesley's bucolic campus, I was overwhelmed by the prospect of living in a gritty city. 4 years earlier, when I'd had an anxiety attack about leaving home for the first semester of college, my mother had concluded one of her shot-in-the-arm pep talks with a bright smile, saying, Incipit Vita Nova, here beginneth a new life. Her words were much more applicable that day in front of the row house, but they were somehow more ironic than comforting now that she was in the hospital. My room was on the 3rd floor. Dad and I hauled my belongings up the narrow staircase, a small upholstered chair, the maple desk I'd received for Christmas when I was 9, a couple of suitcases, a few boxes of books, and my clothes, a collection of peasant blouses and bell-bottom jeans. The walls had recently been repainted a flat white. A scruffy brown shag carpet covered the floor. I finished making the bed while my father fiddled with something at the desk near a window. Here, he said, showing me the coil of rope in his hand. Since there's no fire escape, you can use this if there's ever an emergency. Fire escape? I walked to the window and looked down at the street. I'd never had to think about fire safety before. Here's what you do. He secured one end of the sturdy nylon rope to the desk leg closest to the window and tightened the stout knots he'd placed along it at 1-foot intervals. Just hang this out the window and climb down the knots. Hopefully you'll never need it. I was touched by my engineer dad's practical thoughtfulness. He gave my new digs one last skeptical look as he walked to the door, headed for my mother's hospital bedside. You sure you're okay here? Actually, I wasn't at all sure, but I was grateful he hadn't refused outright to let me move to 334 South Stricker Street. Mom would have raised hell if she'd known about it. Don't worry, I'm fine, I said shakily. Tell Mom I'm okay. Dad drove off in the blue Ford station wagon, leaving me to put my things away and settle into the place I would call home for the next several months. I stacked my medical textbooks on the desk and placed my microscope in its case on the floor. Classes would begin in a few days, and I was as ready as I would ever be, which is to say, not at all. Several things had conspired to throw me off balance besides Mom's hospitalization, including the last-minute scramble to find this apartment when it turned out I hadn't procured a place in the dorm after all. To add to my unease, my 4 housemates were all male, which exacerbated the culture shock of entering medical school from an all-women's college. Thankfully, 2 women lived a couple doors down, where our landlord lived. One of the women, Jane, was a first-year medical student like me. The other, Sadie, was starting social work school. The first of my housemates to introduce himself was a physical therapy student whose room was across the landing from mine. We met when Dad was helping me move in. He would prove to be a cheerful and pleasant neighbor. Later that afternoon, I met Tony, a pharmacy student from the room below mine, and Jack, a first-year social work student who occupied the other second-floor bedroom. As I walked through the living room with some things to put in the kitchen, Jack looked up from the couch where he and Tony were watching TV. "You must be the girl medical student," Jack said, with a noticeable southern drawl. He rose and offered his hand with a smile. There was a twinkle in his eye, and he seemed genuinely pleased to meet me. "She's a medical student?" Tony raised his eyebrows and drew back as if a bee had flown into his face. "Of course, dummy. Bruce told me we were getting a girl medical student, don't you remember? So we need to mind our manners." Grinning, Jack clipped the back of Tony's head playfully with an open palm. Tony looked flustered. "Oh, yeah, sorry, I forgot." Turning to me, he said, "I'm Tony," and hesitantly offered his hand. Though I had to suppress an eye roll at the term girl medical student, it was hard not to laugh. The next day, the last of the merry band showed up. Another first-year medical student who was shoving a case of National Bohemian into the refrigerator when I met him. "Howdy, classmate, I'm Charlie." He wiped his hand on his jeans and offered it to me for a hearty shake. I tilted my head toward the fridge and smiled. "That should keep you going for a while." Charlie laughed. "Yeah, I lived in a fraternity at College Park. Help yourself anytime." Among the adjustments I needed to make was the strangeness of sharing a bathroom with 4 males. Located at the rear of the second floor, the tiny bathroom consisted of a toilet, a sink, and a metal shower stall the size of a phone booth, which proved to be a magnet for mold and soap scum. The first few mornings, I made sure I was fully dressed for the day when entering and leaving the bathroom for a shower, but it was impossible to dry off completely in the steamy cubicle, especially when I could hardly turn around. After a week, I gave up and just wore my bathrobe cinched tightly around my waist. Tampon disposal was another source of embarrassment in this living situation that was the antithesis of my Wellesley dorm. My new home at 334 South Stricker Street was the 3rd row house from the end. It overlooked Carroll Park, the Mount Clair Mansion, Baltimore City's oldest colonial-era structure, and a big white Montgomery Ward distribution center to the south. This was the Mount Clair neighborhood of southwest Baltimore, an area that in 1973 was predominantly made up of white working-class families. The house fronts were brick, or more often, formstone, a type of stucco manufactured locally and dubbed by Baltimore filmmaker John Waters the polyester of brick. Even though there was litter in the gutters and some of the sidewalks buckled, most of the marble stoops gleamed from frequent washing. Children shouted at play and grown-ups shouted in anger. Televisions blared through screened front doors in those first form weeks. first warm weeks, accompanied by the dinner-time fragrance of frying onions. Many of the street corners featured a bar serving cheap beer and what was then known as country and western music. Occasionally, a black man drove a horse and cart down the street calling, "Rags." A few days a month, a different black man with a similar cart, known as an A-rapper, would hawk his fruits and vegetables as if this were 1873 instead of a century later. Those old horse-drawn carts were a striking contrast to the hulking late 60s sedans parked curbside. My next little part of this reading is going to be from later in the same chapter, I think. Anyway, it's about one of the sort of rites of passage of medical school, which is the gross anatomy lab. Throughout that first semester, we spent 4 afternoons a week in the gross anatomy lab. As it had been for our forebears at the turn of the 19th century, the dissection of the cadaver was at the heart of the first-year medical school curriculum. Over the course of the next few months, we took a few deceased human bodies apart, limb from limb, in order to understand how all human bodies are put together. To our faculty's credit, the consciousness movements of the 1960s had given medical educators a greater awareness of the emotional and psychological significance of unveiling the cadaver. We had an entire class period dedicated to preparation for this event, culminating in assurances that there were people we could talk to if we found the process unduly disturbing. With my mother lying in an oncology ward on the other side of town, my only thought through this drawn-out preparatory session was, please don't let our cadaver be a white female. We waited for the moment, sitting on stools at steel tables bearing the indistinct draped forms of cadavers. I tried not to breathe too deeply. The formaldehyde odor, a smell like vinegar but much stronger and without vinegar's redeeming vegetal note, was overwhelming, a smell that would permeate my clothes, skin, and hair for the next 18 weeks. Finally, it was time to remove the drape from our cadaver. One of my table mates did the honors, and sure enough, it was a white female. I turned away. Once I'd collected myself, I could see that our cadaver, our principal teacher of gross anatomy, was older than my mother. Neither skeletal nor obese, she bore the redundant flesh of late middle age. There was nothing especially unusual about her. It wasn't obvious what had led to her demise, and I don't think we ever found out. We were to start our dissection with the muscles of the back. The face would remain covered for a few more sessions to ease us gradually into this stark confrontation with mortality. I looked around the table at the 4 other women comprising my cadaver group, the only all-woman group in the class, knowing that at some point I would have to tell them about my mother. There's a picture in the yearbook of 4 of us working on our dissection with another female student looking on. I'm the tall one with the crossed arms and a ponytail. The acne I'd struggled with throughout college is still evident. A few days later, it was time to uncover the cadaver's head and reveal her face. As disturbing as it was to be confronted with the visage of this erstwhile person who wasn't my mother but could have been, I was glad I wasn't part of the group that held the table that held the 22-year-old white male cadaver, the same age as many of us. He was a slender young man with a few days' beard growth and no discernible signs of illness. How had he died? There was no evidence of wounding by bullet or knife. The arteries in his wrist were intact. His was probably a chemical death, most likely a drug overdose, perhaps a suicide. There was a drawn look on his face, as of some anguish that months of preparation and formaldehyde hadn't been able to eradicate. There was something magnetic about this dead young man. We would file past him singly or in groups and gaze at him like mourners in a funeral home. His table happened to be close to the door, so it was hard to miss him when leaving for a fresh air break, or, for those so inclined, and there were many at that time, a cigarette break. I'm going to fast forward now to my last reading is from the spring of my 3rd year of medical school. This was the year of our basic clinical rotations, and I saved the best not for last. General surgery. My surgical rotation was my last rotation. And it was I wanted to be as prepared as I could be for that because I knew it was going to be hard. The alarm buzzed, waking me up from a dream about my mother in which she was just about to tell me something terribly important. Cursing at the rude awakening, I hit the alarm button with more force than necessary. It was still dark outside. I'd slept until near dawn during the internal medicine rotation that I just completed. But on this 4.5-week general surgery rotation, I had to arrive a full hour earlier with no guarantee that the day would end any sooner. Not that it really mattered, since my life that semester consisted almost entirely of working and studying. I tossed my purse and general surgery textbook onto the passenger seat of my dad's powder blue VW Beetle. The sky shifted from indigo to mauve to pink as I drove across town in the cold, late March morning, taking Eastern Avenue to Baltimore City Hospital, now known as Johns Hopkins Bayview Medical Center. I shivered a little as I approached the old yellow brick edifice where my mother had died 2.5 years earlier. I asked myself why on earth I'd chosen to do my surgery rotation in this awful place, as though returning to the scene of a crime. But I had to face down my demons and prove to myself that my mother's death no longer held me in thrall. The rising sun blazed onto Ward 3B as I entered its hallway from the cafeteria after a quick breakfast, morning cup of coffee in hand. First, I needed to find out what had transpired with my patients overnight. Had anyone died? This had happened once so far in my first 6 days on the ward. I also checked to see if anyone had been moved to the ICU, which was almost a nightly occurrence. Once I'd scanned the census for changes, I started checking the vital signs and lab data on the 10 patients I followed with my resident, Evan Jacobs. There were also wounds to look at and dressings to change before the team rounded at 7:30, but I made sure to touch base with Evan before I did anything. He was not one to applaud initiative on the part of a third-year student. I'd been severely chewed out a few days earlier, after taking it upon myself to change a dressing without him, thus depriving him of the opportunity to look at the wound himself. It seemed you couldn't win. You better not do anything without consulting your resident, yet you were supposed to be first to pipe up with a diagnosis and a plan of treatment on rounds, and if you weren't, you'd be regarded as passive or weak. Asking questions on rounds was another minefield. Only the people who were already regarded as strong students, which on a surgical service automatically excluded women, could afford to ask a question without incurring knowing smirks, even frank ridicule. I'd witnessed one of my female classmates being subjected to such treatment in the first days of the rotation. My eyes had burned. My cheeks had burned with anger and in sympathy with her humiliation. Evan had been on call the previous night and looked like he hadn't slept at all. His black hair was disheveled, his face was paler than usual, and his too close together dark eyes were snapping with impatience. "Here," he said, thrusting a handful of charts at me. "You see these and I'll do the rest." "Don't you want to see the wounds yourself?" I asked timidly. "Nope. Frankly, I don't give a fuck today. They were all okay last night. That bowel obstruction from yesterday and the new admission kept me up all night." Evan frowned as though the patients had prevented him from sleeping on purpose just to make his life difficult, a feeling I was starting to understand a lot better since the start of the general surgery rotation. My first 4 patients were stable, but when I walked into room 342, I discovered that Mrs. Rawlins, a large maternal African-American grandmother in her early 60s, with whom I'd bonded doing her admission history and physical, was in a lot of pain. "This tube in my nose really hurts and my belly's killing me," she moaned. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Rawlins. I need to examine you and check your dressing. Can you bear with me for a minute?" I listened to her abdomen with my stethoscope for bowel sounds, the rumbling and pinging sounds that indicated the resumption of normal intestinal activity after surgery. There were none. Her abdomen was more distended than it had been yesterday, and she groaned and sobbed a little as I pressed gently on it. When I gingerly lifted the dressing from her belly, I found a large, angry-looking vertical scar, red, hard, and with greenish pus between a couple of the stitches. Shit, I thought, a wound infection and an intestinal obstruction. "Mrs. Rawlins," I said, I think we need to get an x-ray and do some blood tests. I need to talk with Dr. Jacobs first. Mrs. Rollins looked up at me with tears in her eyes. Can you just get the nurse to give me my pain medicine now? Of course, I'll tell her right away. In the meantime, a few patients in nearby rooms had begun a Greek chorus of moaning and crying. The mournful noise followed me down the hallway as I continued my rounds. It was all I could do not to put my hands over my ears to drown out the sounds of pain. These women were gynecology patients. All of them had had radical surgery to remove cancers of the reproductive system. Mrs. Rollins' bowel obstruction was evidence that the cancer had attacked her small intestine and was probably no longer amenable to surgical treatment. Her wound was healing poorly and now looked infected, which meant that she wouldn't be a candidate for radiation or chemotherapy either. She would likely die in that bed, crying for pain medication, and there wasn't anything I could do about it, except be as kind and gentle with her as I could, helpless in the face of her suffering. This was the part of being a doctor our professors and attendings hadn't taught us how to deal with. Filled with sad thoughts about Mrs. Rollins, I was distracted on work rounds when Evan and I met with the others on the 3B team to discuss the patients and the plan for the day. Evan glared at me when I gave Dr. Davis, the senior resident, a wrong answer about postoperative pneumonia. By the time rounds were over, the pain chorus had ratcheted up even further. I just couldn't stand it anymore. I had to get some air. I took the stairs 2 at a time and slipped out the fire door in the hospital's southwest corner, then hunkered down just outside the exit and let myself cry for a few minutes. I'd had no idea it would be this hard. Would it have been any easier if I'd been assigned to a ward where the patients weren't all women? My mother's lymphoma had been a different kind of cancer from these patients, and her pain had been bone pain in her legs, not the pain of feeling like your gut was going to explode. I'd never heard the kind of helpless moaning from her that I heard from these women, thank God, but the hopelessness of Mom's plight had been no different than Mrs. Rollins. I dabbed my eyes and blew my nose. When I looked up, a skinny kid who looked about 15 stood in front of me, holding out a joint. "You want some?" he asked shyly. I recoiled at first, but then my heart melted at this simple, if illegal, act of human sympathy and kindness. "No thanks, I have to go back to work." I smiled at the boy. "But it was really nice of you to offer. Have a good day." "You too." Then he mumbled, looking at his feet as he spoke, "Hope you feel better." Oddly enough, I did feel better. The memory of the young man's kindness helped me get through the rest of the day, and the sheer incongruity of it made me smile, even amid all the surus, the wailing women, Evan's glowering, and Dr. Davis's casual contempt.
Thank you so much, Kay. I enjoyed your book so much when I read it, and I love the excerpts you picked out, but especially that last one. You capture so well all of the different feelings and sensations of this time, and I love how the kindness of that young man sort of got you through that very difficult day. My first question relates to the first passage you read and also something in the third. So during the time of your medical training, things had really changed for the better for women in real ways. The birth control pill had been available for a decade. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of Roe in 1973, effectively legalizing abortion. And in the beginning of the book, you write, "We, Wellesley graduates, had experienced the big girl equivalent of what little girls were starting to hear more and more during the 1970s. You can be anything you want to be." Yet, you describe in the book this rampant, overt sexism. So in that first passage, the housemates are saying, "Look, it's the girl medical student." There's a scene in the book where a professor inserts a picture of a Playboy bunny into his lecture. You're routinely called nurse. So talk to us about how you grappled with this paradox throughout your training. You're getting this message that you can be anything you want to be, but you still have to do things like wear pantyhose on a hot summer day, on call for 24 hours, deal with comments on how you did great in a rotation for a female student. How did you get through that? What was it like?
It was difficult. I guess I never really had the feeling of you can do anything. You know, I felt driven to do this, but it was really an uphill slog a lot of the time. You know, I think that it's gotten somewhat better because there are more women, so many more women in medicine now, even if they're not into the as high up and into the higher echelons as much as they should be yet. But I think the culture may have changed somewhat about that kind of thing. Like, but there's still, I know of women who are still called nurse, women doctors, and I read somewhere recently of a woman doctor who, in a meeting, they called all the other people, Dr. So-and-so, and they called her by her first name, you know, kind of. So, you know, I think the externals have changed quite a bit with sheer numbers of women. There are a lot of women in surgery now, too. OBGYN is very largely women. But though still, you know, there's still a lot of that sort of second-class citizen kind of stuff. And of course, now, in the current political climate, where we're all being sent back to the kitchen, and especially if you're white, you're supposed to have a lot of babies. Excuse me, but really, it's, yeah, I'm apprehensive about what's coming, basically, about how it's going to be for women of, you know, younger generations, kind of thing. I mean, some things are going to have to turn around in order for us to regain. We were on a pretty good trajectory, and I think it's going to take a while to get back to it, unfortunately.
Yeah. I would assume that at Wellesley, you heard mostly positive messages.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
It was a very supportive environment, and, you know, when I got to medical school and I talked to some of my friends about what pre-med was like for them, you know, cutthroat, people, you know, tearing up each other's reports or whatever. I mean, I don't know exactly if that's literally true, but there was a lot of stuff that I couldn't even imagine because we were all very supportive of each other. And I think, you know, because it was a prestigious place, we all had a good chance of, I think just about everybody who wanted to go to medical school got in somewhere, which could not be said of a lot of other places.
Yeah.
So we didn't have any of that cutthroat stuff. It was very, a lot of the faculty were women who were very supportive of us. And it was a different atmosphere. It was a big adjustment.
Did you find that you drew on that almost like drawing on a bank account, right? Like, did you draw on those positive experiences, those memories, that support you had during Wellesley when you were now in this new environment that was really
That's a good question.
not supportive?
I think I did. I kind of wish I had more, but I would like to have reached out more to my friends from college, but I was too busy. You know, living my life in medical school kind of thing. But yeah, that probably was helpful, you know, having had that in the background and, you know, yeah.
This brings me to want to talk about the concept of women having it all. It makes me think of two places in the book. So you made the decision not to work 100% all the time in medical school. On the idea of putting everything aside except work, you wrote, "The creative person within me rebelled at the constraints that such a regimen, however temporary, would put on my spirit." And in another place in the book, you have a scene that I found especially poignant. You see a woman across the alley washing vegetables for her family's dinner, and you say for a moment that you wanted to trade places. And when I read that, I wondered if that woman had seen you, what may have crossed her mind. So it just makes me think, are there pitfalls to the "you can have it all" message? And how can women grapple with that message and those expectations today, especially, as you say, we're we're finding some new impediments to the gains that women have achieved in the past decades.
Yeah, I think the you can have it all message is really is a two-edged sword, because it ends up being you have to do it all, and that's not a great message. It's sort of like, well, back in those times, it's not so, I don't think it's as true now, but if you were a woman working 60, 80 hours a week in whatever kind of profession, you still had to, you were in charge of the home too. You know, like husbands would be like babysitting the kids. Excuse me? My husband, of course, actually took care of the kids. But that attitude of, okay, well, you can do all that stuff, but you still have to do all this stuff too. And that, I think, is problematic. And I think that has probably led to a lot of burnout, I would think. And I knew from a mental health standpoint, I just didn't have the stamina to try to, and I wanted to be with my family. I wanted to spend time with my family. I mean, I could have worked longer hours and hired a nanny. I had a babysitter for the kids when kind of thing, but really somebody to kind of run the household as well as take care of the kids. People do that. But I didn't want to miss out on my kids' lives that way. So I elected to work part-time. I was lucky because in neonatology, it's a little like emergency medicine where you kind of can work shifts. Like if you could work all night and then somebody else comes on in the daytime or whatever. And that made it, I did a lot of moonlighting, i.e. working at night, because they always have to have somebody 24/7. But yeah, it's, having it all is definitely complicated, and yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, the way you phrase it in the book, it really goes beyond constraints on time. You say it would have hampered your spirit. This idea that one must work.
Yeah, there had to be more to it than just working all the time.
Yeah.
And yeah.
It reminds me, I had an author recently, I was interviewing her, and she said, whenever I have an author, someone always raises their hand and they say, tell me your writing routine. And I think people want to hear, well, I wake up and I write from 5 a.m. to 6:30 a.m. and then I generate, 100,000 words. And this author said, I don't really write that often because I teach and I also have children. And I think the room was sort of aghast. What? And then, but she said, then she went on to say, I'm not a word generating machine. And I just thought that was such an interesting way to put it. There's work we want to do that's meaningful and important. You as a physician, this woman as a writer and a professor, but ultimately we're human beings.
Yes,
We have a spirit, we have relationships, and we can't put these expectations on ourselves that we will be, more like robots.
Right. And I had the feeling a lot during my training that, you kind of had to be a machine, and that was very difficult. It's not, people aren't meant to be that way.
Yeah.
We're not made for that.
Do you think it's different now for medical students?
I think it is quite different from what I understand. There are a lot of things that are different in terms of, the first 2 years, we sat in this big classroom. It was like being back in high school again, getting lectured at all day, basically. Yeah. Well, now they don't do that. I mean, they have so much stuff online, and they have, study groups that we had study groups too, but I mean, it's, they have a different structure to it than we did. And I think even anatomy, not everybody has a cadaver lab anymore. They have virtual stuff.
Huh.
And there was an article in our alumni magazine, which actually had the picture that I described in the book in it, among other pictures of anatomy lab classes, kind of thing, talking about how University of Maryland is one of the medical schools that still has that. and doesn't have, you know, virtual stuff, which was very interesting.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's
Yeah.
sort of a sideline. I'm not sure where I was going with that, but, but things have changed, yeah.
Good, yeah. So partway through the book is a disturbing account of an examination of a Black woman who has pelvic pain. And this is during your third year, during your third year rotations. This woman goes through a humiliating exam in front of 3 residents and 3 medical students. All are white. The exam is painful. The third year resident is quite condescending. And it was really disturbing to you. You wrote, "I couldn't articulate at the time what was wrong with the way our patient had been treated, but with the benefit of a few decades worth of hindsight, however, I can cite a few things." You know, how do you think racism played a role in what happened, and how have you thought about this incident differently over these decades?
I think there was an understanding, there was a misconception that this young Black woman, she was probably in her late teens or early 20s, was uneducated and probably not very intelligent. I mean, that was the way that they approached her, kind of thing. And I found that disturbing. And also she was really kind of all alone with all these people. Nowadays, for the last couple decades, I think they've had it that you can't do a gynecological exam on a patient without a chaperone. Mm-hmm. And usually the chaperone is a woman, usually a nurse, you know, that can like hold her hand and stuff. But I found that, you know, I could sort of relate to her just sort of lying there and with nobody to take her side, kind of thing, you know. And another thing about that kind of exam is that, as I said in the book, you know, they do it differently now. They tell the person ahead of time, you know, that you're going to have student doctors examining you, because basically that's how student doctors get to be doctors. They have to examine patients, you know. I mean, it's not something that, you know, but they understand, they're talked to ahead of time about what's going to happen. And that was missing at that time. It just wasn't, it was just, people just kind of did that. And the way he kind of left her in the lurch, she didn't understand, she didn't know what he meant by having surgery. It must have been very scary for her, you know. Just a lot of not really thinking of the other person as a person, and not thinking, oh, I wouldn't like it if somebody said, oh, you might have to have surgery, and left it at that, you know, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I think I saw that a lot with, you know, white people dealing with Black patients. It was distressing, yeah.
A striking thing when I was reading the book was the love affair you had with Preston, who was a faculty member. And despite there being far fewer restrictions on women now versus 50 years ago, it is really impossible to imagine a female medical student having a long-term love affair with a faculty, and it sounds like you didn't feel that you needed to hide it. Some people knew what was going on. It feels like that wouldn't happen now. And at the end of the book, you talk about how love is really an inherent part of mentorship, and you stress how Preston was such an important mentor to you. I wondered, we're living in this hypervigilant society where not only would this relationship not be allowed, but I mean, a hand on the shoulder, a hug can be fraught with suspicion, misinterpretation. Do you think we've lost something in mentor-mentee connections, especially across decades where you have a woman and a man, you know, in our hypervigilant society, where even like a hug might be misinterpreted? How do mentors and mentees find connection without feeling like they're crossing a line?
Yeah, it's interesting that seems to me it's too bad you can't hug somebody. I just have to say that, because, you know, and I understand. But I do think we have swung a little too far in that regard. You know, what happened with me and that professor was, you know, that was probably inappropriate then as much as now because of the power differential, even though he didn't really have a say in my grade or any of that kind of stuff.
Right.
You know, I wasn't like,
He wasn't a professor teaching a
Right.
class that you were
Yeah.
taking, right?
but that whole thing got me, you know, when we looked at this question before, it got me thinking about the whole idea of mentorship. And I
Yeah.
think that, you know, people think of a mentor as somebody that teaches you something and sets an example for you. But an important part of it, you know, I wasn't like learning how to do neuroscience or whatever from him, you know. But an important part of it is that they encourage you, and they, you know, they want you to succeed, and they care about how you being successful. And I think that was really the biggest part of it for me, was I felt seen, as they say now. And at that time, there weren't a whole lot of people that were making me feel that way. And
Right.
that was very important.
Right.
And I think that's an important part of mentorship, you know. And that's something that I hope never gets lost. I mean, you may have to be careful about how you pat somebody on the back, but, you know, that sense of, it is a kind of intimacy of, you know, you're working closely with a person. Okay, I'm going to show you how it's done, and,
Yeah.
you know, and you can do it, and all that sort of thing, you know. And
It's
I had,
really
I
a
had
relationship,
a little bit of
yeah.
a feeling about that kind of a thing with my therapist. You know, I had it like the first few weeks that I was in therapy with this guy, I was like madly in love with him. And of course, talk about boundaries. I mean, he was very, you know, I mean, I'm sure he knew what was going on, but he was very, the way he was supposed to be, and keeping it professional. And eventually I was able to, you know, get over it.
Yeah.
But the reason I felt that way about him was because I felt seen.
Right.
You know, he you know, wanted me to get better, and
Yeah.
that was very important. So, yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, it's sort of, it's more than teaching someone the craft or
Yes.
giving them advice. You have a real connection, a real relationship. Someone's invested in you.
Yes. Yeah.
Do we have? Oh, great. Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah.
Just so that the online audience can hear them. And if you don't mind, I'm going to start here. This question is, were you surprised by any of your recollections during the writing of your memoir?
Yes. I have to.
Can you elaborate?
It's hard to give specific examples, but I relied heavily on my journals for, you know, to help me remember stuff. And there were things in there I'd completely forgotten about, as well as things I remembered vividly that I had written hardly anything about. So it just kind of shows how different, kind of unreliable, not unreliable, but sort of ephemeral and in and out memory can be, basically.
This is another question that piggybacks on that question. How did you recreate your dialogue from so many years ago? Did you have trouble finding the voices of the respective characters in your story?
Actually, I had a lot of help from my writing group with that. Because, you know, my first drafts of things would be sort of like, this happened and that happened and the other thing happened. And they're like, no, you have to have scenes and dialogue. And they showed me how to do it. They were all writing fiction. And they were able to show me, you know, how to make it more like, you know, more readable, I guess.
This question talks about, or alludes to drafts. So I'm going to go with this one now. Can you talk about how you shaped your memoir? How many drafts did you go through, and what was the moment that was hardest to remove?
Wow. I went through a lot of drafts. And I cut a lot of stuff out. It's hard to say what was the hardest thing to remove. There was one particular relationship that I ended up not talking about that was somewhat difficult to get rid of, but it was better off without it.
I'm working on a memoir and I'm currently stuck due to the potential of offending people in my life. How have you navigated this concern?
Ah, yes, that is a very difficult thing. There are people in here that would probably be offended, by what I wrote. I changed their names, and I tried to change characteristics about them. I mean, I think that the individuals that I'm thinking of would probably recognize themselves, but I don't know that anybody else would recognize them. I changed most of the names of most of the people, except for my family. There were some people that were there just so very fleetingly. It was only just a sentence or two, and I didn't bother to change their names. They were generally people that were friendly and being nice to me, and there wasn't any controversy, that they would have felt bad or anything. But yeah, it's hard. Now, there's some people that say, oh, you should get permission. Well, no. I feel strongly that that's not necessary, or that it's your book. You need to write your book. You might need to back off on a little stuff at time, after a while. But I think if you make enough changes that the person isn't instantly recognizable to everybody, you should be okay.
What makes a great memoir? And aside from your own, what titles would you recommend?
Wow, there's a lot of good memoirs out there. I'm reading one right now called Mother Mary Comes to Me by Arundhati Roy, who wrote The God of Small Things. And it's very interesting. Her mother was terrible, but anyway, that's aside. Other memoirs, there's a person that writes personal essays, so it's not strictly memoir, but she's a fantastic writer named Joanne Beard. I'm trying to think of other specific memoirs. But I think what makes it good is, having it sort of seeing the humanity of everybody in the story, even the people that, maybe didn't treat you well or whatever kind of thing. Kind of the greater humanity kind of thing, I guess.
What is the one thing that you would share with women just starting medical school?
Well,
It could be two if you'd like.
gird your loins. Be prepared for a lot of challenge, and not necessarily, sexism type challenge, but I think the challenges now are, a lot of the challenges now for all medical students are, the incursion of corporations, corporate medicine, and AI, and those kinds of things. So much.
I brought this up, but we do have a writing process question. There's always a writing process question. Can you talk about your writing process? Are there any idiosyncrasies?
Idiosyncrasies, I love that. Yeah, I'm not a writing machine, no. Well, I like to write in my journal in the morning, and I've been writing poetry lately, so I try to write a poem in the morning too. And I haven't really been writing too much else. I kind of do it in chunks of a few hours at a time if I'm writing a thing like the memoir. When I was working on that, I would do that more. It was a little later in the day that I would do that, but yeah, it's not a hard and fast. I don't have a rigid routine.
Okay. I want to thank our online audience for all those questions. I'm going to hand this over to Susan to wrap up the program.
Well, great. Thank you, Kay, so much.
Thank you.
I think your book appeals to such a wide variety of audiences, people who went through professional training around this time. And I think also, as we could tell from the questions, some younger people who joined today who may be going in a medical field or are writers and are curious about memoir. So, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Cleve.
Again, I would like to thank this afternoon's moderator, Susan Keatley. You can applaud, please. And our author, Kay White True. Thanks everybody here, and thanks to our online audience. Thanks to Greedy Reads to be our bookseller. We'll see you again next time.